Is Trump abandoning diplomacy with Russia? Weighs harsh new sanctions.
President Trump's interest in a congressional bill to impose tough sanctions on Russia has raised questions among observers about whether he has entirely abandoned efforts to pursue a diplomatic solution with Moscow. A bipartisan bill in the US Congress aimed at imposing harsh sanctions on Russia to pressure Moscow into peace talks with Ukraine made significant strides this week. However, the legislation still lacks crucial backing from President Trump needed for it to pass. President Trump, who pledged during his campaign to end the war in Ukraine, has yet to reveal the specifics behind that promise. In recent weeks, he has become increasingly vocal about his frustration with Russian President Vladimir Putin, especially over Putin's refusal to accept a ceasefire and Moscow's intensified attacks. On July 8, Trump approved the transfer of US defensive weapons to Ukraine. 2 days later, he moved closer than ever to supporting the sanctions bill, although, according to a source familiar with the matter, he still has not signed off on the bill's final text. Senate Majority Leader, Republican Senator John Thune, said earlier this week that the Senate could vote on the bill later this month. House Speaker, Republican Congressman Mike Johnson, expressed similar optimism. Meanwhile, Senator Lindsey Graham and Secretary of State Marco Rubio privately told European diplomats that the bill would advance soon, according to a source directly involved in the discussions. Still, it remains unclear whether Trump has fully abandoned the push for a diplomatic track with Russia. Some supporters acknowledge that the White House's demand for broad veto powers over the sanctions could render the bill more symbolic than substantive. Speaking to reporters in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia on July 11th, after his second meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the two sides had discussed a new idea that he would bring back to brief President Trump on. He declined to provide details, saying only, "This new idea does not guarantee immediate peace, but it could open a door that leads us down that path." However, he reiterated that President Trump is growing increasingly frustrated with Moscow's hardline stance and noted that the US had warned Russia weeks ago that a sanctions bill might soon pass. The Russia sanctions bill, co-sponsored by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham and Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal, would impose sweeping penalties on numerous Russian individuals, government agencies, and financial institutions. It also proposes sanctions on other countries that maintain trade ties with Moscow, including tariffs of up to 500% on nations that purchase Russian oil, gas, uranium, and other exports. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly urged Western allies to ramp up sanctions on Moscow to force the Kremlin to accept a ceasefire as a necessary step toward ending the conflict, now entering its 40th month. According to two US officials, work on finalizing the sanctions bill has accelerated over the past week. A source close to President Trump said the current draft still requires adjustments, noting that it does not yet grant the president enough flexibility to pursue an independent foreign policy apart from Congress. The White House is now coordinating with Congress and the bill's sponsors to ensure that the final text is aligned with and supportive of the president's foreign policy objectives, the source added. One person involved in drafting the legislation also said congressional staffers have been working in recent days to address technical issues, such as how to ensure the sanctions do not disrupt the operations of the US Embassy in Moscow. A spokesperson for Senator Graham told Reuters the bill likely would not come up for debate in the Senate until at least the week of July 21st, given other legislative priorities. The bill must also pass the House, but with that chamber set to begin its August recess in just 2 weeks, time for debate is very limited. Some supporters of the bill acknowledge that it carries a largely symbolic weight, since President Trump retains broad authority to veto sanctions measures, and if he chooses, he can impose penalties through executive orders without relying on congressional legislation.